Welcome everyone. Thanks for braving the terrible Miami rainy weather, by the way, for being here. So since Professor Bergeron's not here today, I will be giving a presentation on an obscure early alto saxophone player. So, you probably never heard of Paul Stump Evans. Stump Evans, raise your hand if you have. I'd be shocked. Like I thought nobody. So, Stump Evans, fascinating side street on the history of the jazz saxophone. Someone who doesn't get a lot of attention. And I'll talk about reasons perhaps why that may be as we go along. But first, let's learn a little bit about him. So I'm calling him a neglected jazz master of the alto saxophone. So some basic bio-information. Not a lot's really known about him. He died really young. As you can see from the notes I have on the board, he was only 24. But in his short life, he made some of the most seminal recordings of early jazz history, which are, of course, the Jelly Roll Morton recordings, which we'll talk about in a minute. So he was born in Kansas, and then died in Kansas, but he spent most of his professional years in Chicago. He studied originally with his father, a couple of random instruments, and then eventually settled on the saxophone and the clarinet. So there's a picture, by the way, of Jelly Roll Morton's band. Stump Evans is not in this picture as far as I can tell, and from the research I've been able to do, I don't think that there even exists a picture of Stump Evans definitively. So all of the photos in this presentation are basically of people he worked with. That's just about all I could find with the resources I had. So, some career basics. During his time in Chicago, he sort of performed with a who's who of early jazz stars, early jazz recording artists. So as you can see, a long list including Joe Oliver and Jelly Roll Morton, probably the two biggest names on that list. So, and again, here's another picture. I'm not sure if Stump Evans is in there, but most likely not pictured. Some of the key early recordings he was on, you can see I've got them listed here. We're going to check out a couple, Billy Goat Stomp and Beale Street Blues. But before we go on and actually get into that, I just wanted to talk briefly about why I'm talking about this guy. So Stump Evans, for me, is the epitome of the abuse of the saxophone in early jazz historiography. When you learn about jazz history or teach about jazz history, everyone talks about the tenor saxophone, right? And they don't even start talking about the tenor saxophone until really the early swing era, right? So in the usual telling of jazz history, who does the jazz saxophone history start with? What do you think? Coleman Hawkins, who else?
Trumbauer.
Lester Young, maybe Frankie Trumbauer. So we're already talking late 20s, early 30s, and we're all talking about tenor saxophone players, or in the case of Frankie Trumbauer, basically a C melody and bass saxophone player. So, where's the alto saxophone in the early jazz historiography? Well, it's there, so, and we'll get to it in a minute, but it's just interesting to think about how, even though the saxophone is one of the most iconically jazz instruments, in the popular imagination, when people think jazz, they think saxophone, right? If you had to pick one instrument that epitomizes jazz, it's the saxophone, in the way that the guitar epitomizes rock and roll, or perhaps the violin or the piano epitomizes classical music. So, yet, despite saxophone's status as being the jazz instrument, not a lot is written or researched about the very, very early use of the jazz saxophone. And in addition to Stump Evans just being an example of an important early jazz saxophone player, as we'll see in a minute, I'm arguing that he actually really anticipated a lot of the style characteristics of later generations of saxophone players. So that'll be a theme we'll be returning to again and again. And then the final note before we go on is that we have to remember that in this era of history, this style of jazz is very different from later styles. The number one biggest difference to my ears is the emphasis on sort of jocularity, playing around, goofing off. The music is largely a party music, and there's a lot of humor built in. So we'll hear, especially in Billy Goat Stomp, an early example of what might be called a novelty number, but the humor within the music shouldn't detract from the high level of musicianship that's required to pull off the kind of musical stunts that these guys are doing. Some of his stylistic features and the innovations of Paul Stump Evans, again, unfortunately not pictured, but there's a picture of Jelly Roll Morton on the far left with one of the iterations of his bands from the late 20s, which is around the time that Stump Evans was recording with him. But anyway, Stump Evans, very virtuosic, as we're going to see. He anticipated some of the later advances in jazz. I've listed a few things up here on the board. Playing around with subtle changes in timbre, what scholar Ollie Wilson sometimes calls the heterogeneous sound ideal, which is just a general term for African American song styles, in which there's a preference for a variety of timbres within an ensemble, vertically, and then also horizontally. A variety of timbres are considered desirable or preferential, even in the course of one line, one melodic line. So imagine Louis Armstrong, right? In the course of one melodic phrase, he might use a bright tone, a dark tone, a wide vibrato, a growl, a shake. All of these things can happen in one melodic statement. So that's an important feature of African American music styles in general, but particularly jazz, and Stump Evans clearly on board with that preference. He has a really clear alto saxophone tone as well, which I think you can hear in his sort of pure sound. I think you can hear the seeds of the more modern alto sound that we usually associate with Charlie Parker. You should be able to hear, if your ears agree with mine, that he's got a different style than Johnny Hodges, who, even though Johnny Hodges is a later generation, Johnny Hodges has that sort of stereotypical alto sound, really wide vibrato, rich, lush. You might describe it as a wet sound. Stump Evans is a little more dry. He does a lot of polyrhythmic things that are a little bit common in early jazz, but that we more associate with later styles of jazz, like mixing around, mixing up duple and triple time fields and rhythmic figures. This ensemble, this iteration of the Jelly Roll Morton ensemble in particular, also really explored a lot of programmatic types of musical textures, which we'll get to, especially with Billy Goat Stomp again. And you can hear in that perhaps the seeds of the Duke Ellington programmatic music. You can think of all of his famous music that evokes the sounds of locomotive trains and so on and so forth. There's a precedent for that set with this ensemble. A couple other things I've got up here, so you can read them for yourself, but just thinking about polyrhythmic superimpositions, which we'll actually see surprisingly, and then extended techniques, especially slap tonguing, which we'll hear a little bit of as well. So, moving on, let's actually check out some of his music now. So I've got a transcription analyzed up here for you to follow along with, and you can see the timestamp. This comes in about 48 seconds in, but we're going to listen to the whole recording because it's just a classic recording. Very, very impressive little cadenza. It goes by so quick that you don't realize how virtuosic it is. And I also think it's worth pointing out that Jelly Roll Morton really gave Stump Evans sort of the featured spot here. You would think it's the band leader. He would take the final cadenza. But he gives the final cadenza of the piece to Stump Evans. So any thoughts or observations on that recording? I'm just going to scroll back and point out a few things that, again, that really jumped out at me. So, in this first section here, it's pretty straight ahead blues vocabulary for the time. But again, just notice how he peppers in triplet and duple figures. And the most interesting feature of the next solo is when he does this figure you can see in the second system, where he takes a phrase and displaces it, which again is something that we normally associate with Charlie Parker, for example, later styles of jazz, and he's already exploring those sort of complex rhythmic ideas of taking something and shifting it to a different part of the bar to really play with your sense of where the downbeat is and mess around with your expectations about where the phrase is going to cadence or end. Any thoughts or questions before we move on to the next example? Yeah?
It seems like he's bending a lot of notes, and I'm noticing the timbral differences that you talked about in the previous slide.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of pitch bending. And to back up, he really, in the third system here, when he enters and the section when the whole blues modulates up a fourth, when he enters for his solo, that's a really pronounced pitch bend that takes a lot of control on the saxophone. So that is definitely something that might have informed later musicians, particularly Johnny Hodges. I don't know for 100% if Johnny Hodges ever actually got to hear Stump Evans. It's unlikely that he heard him live, but highly possible that he heard him on recordings as a young man. But either way, the playing around with timbre is definitely a standard practice jazz thing. Stump Evans is just particularly good at it. So, yeah.
If you would have heard him on recordings, what exactly would he have been listening into? They have had to go to a separate place to listen to this type of recording at the time? Like, how exactly would that be accessible, like, at that time? I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, in the 1920s, if you were middle class, particularly upper middle class, you could afford to buy a record player in some situations. But also, if there were any jazz radio stations in your area, not a huge amount of this music was broadcast on the radio, but that's one possibility. But normally, records, the record industry was in its early stages, but records were around back then. That's obviously how the music's been passed down to us. The most exposure that audiences got to this particular style, though, was in person. We're really, at this stage of jazz, we're really still talking about an essentially minority music that's confined to relatively small geographic communities in New Orleans and Chicago. But very quickly, as some of these live performances would be broadcast over radio, and as some of these records were made, the music started spreading really quickly. So that within 10 or 15 years, obviously, we've got jazz being arguably the most popular style of music in the country with the swing era. This is only about 10 years before that, maybe even less. So as you can see, this recording is 1927. And what really kicked it off is, of course, the original Dixieland Jazz Band. Freddie Keppard, actually, who's an African-American trumpet player, got an offer to record earlier than the original Dixieland Jazz Band, but he turned it down because he was afraid of people stealing his licks. He also famously would sometimes put a handkerchief over his fingers to cover so no one could steal what he was playing. But once the original Dixieland Jazz Band recorded in the early 20s, it kicked off kind of the jazz craze, right, the roaring 20s. So these records would have been available, not to everybody for financial reasons, but records weren't extraordinarily expensive. So let's listen to Billy Goat's Stump. Again, I'm going to play the whole recording because it's just a remarkable musical artifact. And it's, again, probably an example of what might be called a novelty piece, but really, really virtuosic. So fun, funny, but there's a very serious musical side to what the ensemble is doing here. So, and again, I've got the timestamp for when the solo begins. That solo goes by so quickly, I'm going to back up so we can hear it again. And also point out, now this time, the two things that jump out to me most are, number one, the slap tone, which is, because of the recording quality, it's a little hard to hear, but he's employing a technique called slap tonguing, which is exactly what it sounds like. You take your tongue and you slap it against the reed, and you get this rhythmic sort of popping sound at the beginning of the articulation. He does that to really create a rhythmic impetus to some of his lines, and it sort of anticipates the general concept of extended techniques, which you really see later, particularly with avant-garde musicians. So you can think John Coltrane using growls and false fingerings for percussive effects, and then the Duke Ellington Ensemble, all the different extended instrumental techniques they did. There's a precedent set with recordings like this of using the instrument to evoke sounds that are not typical from the instrument. So let's listen to the solo again. And then in addition, obviously, to the slap tonguing technique, at the top of this slide, you can see a really pronounced implied dotted quarter superimposition, which is pretty hip, and again, I would argue, kind of anticipates some of the techniques that we'd expect of later generations of jazz musicians. So I'm backing up to just a few seconds before Stump Evans solo. And some of the dialogue that you hear in recordings like this with Jelly Roll Morton's band is Jelly Roll Morton himself. He has a really expressive voice, and he's not afraid to talk and shout on his recordings, especially on these novelty numbers. So, any thoughts, observations, questions on that one?
I was wondering, at times it almost sounds like parts of it are worked out like that. Well, I'm just wondering that section you were talking about, emphasizing the dotted quarter note. I can't tell. Perhaps it is the slap tongue, but it sounded like the drummer was hitting all those accents with him. Maybe that's just my ears not being used to the sound of the slap tongue in this recording quality. But I don't know whether to your ear that's just the sound of him tonguing or whether the drummer's actually hitting all those with him.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. Again, we're dealing with audio fidelity issues. But, I mean, it really could go any one of three ways.
Yeah.
It could be that it's just him, and it was really impromptu, and what you're hearing is just the sound of the slap tonguing, and perhaps even some crackling on the record that's induced by the slap tonguing. It could be that they planned it out beforehand at some point. But I would still give sort of compositional credit to Stump Evans for doing it.
Yeah.
And another possibility is that before they went into the studio to record this tune, they might have played it 100 times at live gigs, on live radio broadcasts, etc. And maybe Stump Evans kind of figured this thing out, this dotted quarter thing, and it became part of his shtick. It became part of his routine. And then as he started doing it every time they performed the tune, maybe someone is jumping on board with him and tapping or clapping along. I think those are all possibilities, and without the smoking gun proverbial, we're never going to know. But it's definitely a fascinating technique to hear him do that slap tonguing technique like that. So, and as you can see from the analysis, I also pointed out a couple other just little things. He's using a lot of chromatic neighbor tones and mixing around major and minor third sonorities, and then occasionally throwing in that kind of major minor seventh sound that we usually associate sometimes with later styles of jazz as well. So, well, little bits of chromaticism creeping in. So, if you buy my arguments that this guy's awesome, it begs the question, why is he so obscure then? So there's a lot of reasons. Obviously, he died young. He only managed to record on a few recordings. There's not a lot of information available about him. Like I said, from the research I was able to do, I was not able to easily track down any photographs that were definitively of Stump Evans. And again, like I mentioned earlier, the saxophone, for various reasons, is not a huge part of early jazz historiography. Usually people emphasize trumpet cornet players, piano players, blues singers. And then in the long arc of history as well, he was a sideman, and that's a theme I'll be returning to later with some of the other people I talk about down the road. Sidemen never get the same amount of attention as band leaders. Even if someone starts out as a sideman and goes on to have a successful career as a leader, that's no guarantee that they get the same amount of attention. So these are all potential explanations. And the final picture here is of King Oliver's band. Stump Evans did perform and record with them, but he's not in this photograph. So, fascinating musician. Like I said, under-researched, really anticipated a lot of later style developments, and just making some really hip, fun music early on, and showing really that the alto saxophone is a viable instrument in jazz, because in that era almost nobody was playing the alto saxophone. Most people played clarinet. If they were playing saxophone, it was most likely tenor or C melody. So, any questions? Any thoughts, any observations? Yeah.
Are there more recordings than just those two? You had his discography up.
Yeah, those are just two of the recordings that he did with Jelly Roll Morton. I can back up. We can see them all again. He did at least 2 recording sessions with Jelly Roll that led to 4 tracks being released. Actually, it looks like 3. It was 2 Victor recording sessions and 1 for Bluebird. Recorded a couple songs with King Oliver, and then the Priscilla Stewart example, he's actually playing C melody saxophone on that recording. This might be pretty much comprehensive. There might have been a couple of things I missed, but at least for what's well known and well disseminated, this is basically all he was able to do. The guy died at the age of 24, and he moved to Chicago in his late teens, so we're talking about at most maybe only 10 years being active. So when you factor in it takes time to meet people, to get established, to start getting gigs and work your way up into these premier ensembles, it's actually in some ways surprising that this many recordings of him survive. And it's worth pointing out that before he died as well, he had already had to leave Chicago. And he ended up, I believe, working with someone maybe in North Texas, or he ended up outside of Chicago for a short period of time, and then he contracted tuberculosis and died, and ended up back in Kansas City when he died. Or not Kansas City, Kansas. So.
Is there?
Derek, did you have?
I was going to ask the cause of his death.
Yeah, tuberculosis.
Yeah, and is there a reason that I see that you said that not other musicologists have really discovered him? Do you think there's, I mean, other than the obscurity of him, do you think that just that there hasn't been this kind of comprehensive study of early saxophone, or who do, when you're talking about early jazz musicologists, do they also consider like Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins and these guys sort of the start of jazz saxophone?
That's a good question. The jazz scholarship is generally not quite as cut and dry as classical scholarship in terms of the areas that people have expertise in. So obviously, since you guys all go to school here, you know David Ake, who's one of my main mentors. He's one of the premier jazz musicologists alive, but he doesn't necessarily have a specialty or an area of focus per se in terms of a historical style period. In the same way that very often you can find classical musicologists who, you know, their expertise will be late career Mozart or something like that, or, you know, Italian opera circa 1600. For various reasons, jazz scholarship tends to be a little bit more blurry, and people tend to move more fluidly between different eras. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any one person whose sole area of research is early jazz. There are certainly a lot of historical societies, local historical societies, that focus on the preservation of early jazz. And there was actually a lot of fighting about early jazz in the first half of the 20th century. There's a fascinating book that came out, I think, in 1956. I think it's a Farrell and Grossman book. It was published by NYU. It's called The Heart of Jazz. It's a wild read. Long story short, one of the main arguments of the book is that basically New Orleans style jazz with collective improvisation is the only real jazz, and Louis Armstrong ruined jazz by making it all about him, all about soloist, and it ruined the collective spirit, and everything post that is not real jazz. And this is coming out of a nascent musicology department, nascent jazz musicology department in New York in the 50s. I'm not sure if they mentioned Stump Evans in that book. They certainly talk about Jelly Roll Morton. But it's just an area of jazz history that hasn't gotten a lot of attention until recent decades, with the exception of these types of movements I'm talking about, of traditionalists and people who for various reasons, become very invested in early jazz. So it's an interesting area of scholarship. And we have to acknowledge that I think racism is part of the lack of information that's available. We're essentially talking about music that, as one scholar put it, started out as basically an ethnic music of the black ghettos. And those are not my words, those are the words of another scholar. But the scholar used this particular phrase to draw attention to the fact that a music that started within a very small section of one city in the United States within 10 or 20 years was essentially the mainstream popular style of music, or at least its musical offspring were. And so we're talking about essentially African American musicians making music for other African Americans in the 1920s. Mainstream scholarship didn't do much to document this or pay attention to it, and it's taken decades for jazz to be taken seriously in academia, as we all know. And when jazz finally started to be taught, sorry, this is a tangent now, but it's relevant to your question, I think.
Yes.
By the time jazz starts to get taught in the 60s, and then especially as it takes off in the 70s and 80s, there's a real big emphasis on practical knowledge, what we would now consider vocational training. So the idea is teach musicians how to play so that they can go out and get a gig and make a living. And in the decades post-1950, again, with the exception of these historical societies, like I'm from California, I grew up hearing the Ken Robinson Dixieland Band, which was a ghost band from a guy who was in Central California, that he started the band in the 1940s. So it was already passé. It was a Dixieland revival band, started in the 40s, that has been sustained until today. Some people don't like the term Dixieland anymore. They prefer the term traditional jazz or New Orleans style jazz. But I grew up hearing that ensemble with a couple of the original members, actually. So there's plenty of projects like that. I also grew up being exposed to the Sacramento Traditional Jazz Society. So there are pockets of the culture that cultivate just traditional jazz. But outside of that, if you're going to get a gig, the styles of jazz you're going to be playing are basically swing, post-swing, bebop, post-bop. And so in the pedagogy, and therefore in the research of jazz, the lion's share of the attention has been given to music from maybe the late 30s until the early to mid 60s. And so it's only been in the past few decades as academia has sort of been blown wide open, and you're seeing movements like new musicology, which intentionally focuses on musical cultures that have been traditionally ignored by the academy. And when you've got jazz education expanding, and now there's more intellectual room, there's more financial opportunity for people to really extend the focus of jazz on both ends of the historical spectrum. So you've got people talking about contemporary or modern jazz and earlier styles of jazz more frequently now, but it's a relatively recent development. Definitely only in the past 2 or 3 decades, I would say, that it's really started to happen. So there's a lot of reasons why this era is under-researched. Again, lack of data. It's not been deemed practical for a lot of people for a long time. Jazz scholars tend not necessarily to be hyper-specialists. They might have a project that they specialize on one thing. I know Stanley Crouch for 20 years researched Charlie Parker's early life in particular, and he just released that book a year or so ago. I think it's called Kansas City Lightning. It's an entire book, very well researched, that only talks about Charlie Parker's life up until he moved to New York permanently, basically. So just that early part of his life. So, but I don't think you would say that Stanley Crouch is is only focused on Charlie Parker's whole career. So the people who study this music tend to, I think, get maneuvered just by the data into the same channels that already exist of emphasizing the same narratives of Buddy Bolden and his entourage of like-minded people, and that the cultural milieu that allowed that to happen, to King Oliver, to Louis Armstrong, and Jelly Roll Morton's in there, and then that moves to Chicago, and then Duke Ellington, and so there's a narrative, that's the standard narrative, and saxophone players just don't figure into it very much until Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young, with maybe Frankie Trumbauer thrown in. So that's part of my point here, is that these narratives exist because we make them, and because we make them, we can always amend them. And in the same way that perhaps you could argue that certain instruments are ignored in other eras and need to be given more attention in this era, I think the saxophone, particularly the alto saxophone, is given short shrift. And I'm saying this because I was shocked, I was surprised when I first heard this recording, these recordings. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's an alto saxophone being recorded in the 1920s. That's my instrument of choice. I didn't know such a thing existed because no one ever showed me. So the same thing applies to other instruments in other eras. Yeah.
Something that's kind of interesting is early swing era big bands, like the Dorsey Orchestra. I guess you could say the Glenn Miller Orchestra, that's a little bit later. They had modern saxophone setups, like throughout those two tenors and a Barry. As early as, I'm going to guess like 1932 is like an early time for that. And it seems like saxophones were like common in jazz orchestras in the 30s, but as a soloistic instrument, I mean, you only have Coleman Hawkins and like you said, Lester Young. And so like at the time, it's weird that they're in jazz orchestras, but not prominent soloistic instruments, if that makes sense. They're almost like extensions of the tenor saxophone.
Yeah, the saxophone in general, even when tenor saxophone does appear in traditional New Orleans style jazz, it's often in more of a supportive role, and we tend to think of the clarinet and the trumpet as being more featured in the same way that you as a trombonist know. The trombone is often relegated to a sort of, it's just there to support the other stuff that's going on. Which, there are people who challenge that narrative as well, like Kid Ory, very early on. But the saxophone also has a complicated tradition because the ensembles you're talking about, the white early swing bands, essentially evolved from two different musical environments that sort of merged and created a side stream, which is big band swing, because you've got parallel traditions of what we would now, or actually what then they would call as well, but you might call suite bands, which are, or society bands, which are essentially light orchestras that would play for the entertainment of white people, usually wealthy people. So you can imagine, picture an early 20th century wealthy person's house party at their mansion on Long Island, where they have dancing and dinner and music. The music would most likely be kind of like a proto big band. So it would probably have a couple of strings, maybe some French horns. It would be like a small version of an orchestra, almost like a pickup band.
So like a Paul Whiteman or something
exactly.
like that?
Paul Whiteman's orchestra comes out of that tradition. And you had that tradition developing in the early 20th century. You had the marching band, general American tradition of marching bands, which was around for at least half a century by then, and the saxophone was found to be a useful instrument for marching bands because you can march and play it, and it's loud. And then you've got the hot jazz as a contrast to the sweet music or society music. You've got hot music, which is now what we consider traditional jazz. And all of these things, and of course marching band influenced that as well, but all of these things are kind of mixing together. And the saxophone was more entrenched in the marching band and a little bit in the sweet society band or quasi-orchestral tradition than it was entrenched in the hot tradition early on. And so when you get those early white swing bands, which were essentially developing this sweet tradition and incorporating more musical elements from African American musical traditions and other cosmopolitan traditions. To oversimplify, you can think of it as sweet bands trying to cop jazz stylistic elements because it was becoming very popular in the 1920s. That's kind of where that tradition starts to develop. And so it makes sense to me that the saxophone would, exactly like you're describing, that it would be there, it would be present, but would be more as an ensemble fixture rather than a featured soloist. A lot of these society dance bands would have vocalists anyway, and so they would sing. They would have a vocalist who would sing when everyone's having dinner, and then when it's time to dance, the vocalist might take a break, or they might sing some numbers and alternate with the ensemble just playing dance numbers. And the music of these, even before Paul Whiteman, but these kind of society bands, the music would be very mixed. It would be like classical fare, operetta numbers, music from what we would now call maybe early musical theater, popular songs, waltzes, that kind of material. So.
Cool. Wonderful. Thank you.
Not